How would Rome have looked at the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Middle Ages around the year 600 AD? How must it have felt to walk through the streets of this city that were once so great? Hey guys, welcome to our channel. Today we will discuss what Rome looked like in 600 AD. If you want to know, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel because we have a lot to tell you. The great city of Rome had endured 3 significant sieges, been conquered, and changed alliances 5 times. How must it have felt to walk through the streets of this city that were once so great? The Gothic Wars, which started when the Eastern Roman general Belisarius entered the city in 536 and ended when the Eastern Roman general Narses retook the city 15 years later in 551 AD, were an absolute disaster for Rome. People moved out of the city in enormous numbers because of widespread famine caused by the climate change in 536 AD, the plague of Justinian after 542 AD, and the sieges. Before the Gothic Wars, 100 to 200,000 people were living in Rome. After the wars, there were only 30,000 people lived there. Even though the 3 interceptions of the 5th century had already hurt the city and its people, Western Roman emperors Odoacer and Theoderich all made significant repairs. Tax money was used by Rome's urban prefects to keep the city in good shape until the year 536, but the Gothic Wars destroyed the Ostrogothic kingdom. The Eastern Romans weren't interested in rebuilding Rome or returning to its former glory. No money from the empire was given to Rome to fix its monuments. The guards did not walk the streets as they did during the time of Majorian, Odoacer, and Theodoric to keep the old buildings safe. After beating the Goths for good in 553 AD, Narses and Eastern Roman general moved to Rome and lived in the old palace on Palatine Hill. People say that he lived there until he died in 573 AD, but this is sometimes questioned. But even if the palace had been fixed up under Theodoric, when the Ostrogothic king used the money from the wine tax to fix up the grand old imperial palace, there is no evidence that this was done under Narses. In fact, people know that Narses stole some statues from the empty temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus to decorate his rooms in the palace. If the Ostrogothic kingdom had kept some of Rome's imperial splendor, the grand old buildings would now be falling apart quickly because no one was taking care of them or fixing them. So by AD 600, the situation was even worse a few decades after Narses died. By now, the Senate was gone for good, so had the institutions and offices of ancient Rome. During the Gothic Wars, they were all destroyed. The only institution left from the time of the empire was the Christian church, and the popes had become the most influential people in the city after the war destroyed the Senate. In 600, Gregory the Great was the most important Christian leader in the West. In fact, Italy was already in the early Middle Ages. Could we still say Italy and Rome were in late antiquity before the Gothic Wars? By 600 AD, it was clear that the Dark Ages had started to come to the oldest province of the Roman Empire. Gregory was born in Rome in 540 AD during the Gothic War. He saw all the bad things that happened in the middle of the 6th century and could testify to how Rome was getting worse and worse. After 568 AD, the Lombards moved into Italy, which happened significantly during the Great Migrations. 2 groups would fight until they were almost done with each other. The third group took advantage of the weakness and lack of power to settle in with the emperor's borders. So after 568 AD, the parts of the Roman Empire that had just been taken over by the Lombards would no longer be part of the empire. So in 578 AD, Pope Gregory went to Constantinople and asked the emperor for military help against the Lombards. But the Eastern Romans couldn't send troops because the Persians were always a threat in the east, and now the Slavs were coming down from the north along the Danube border. So Gregory was by himself. He was the only one who could keep the city from falling apart even faster. And from 590 until he died in Rome in 604, he wrote about how sad and empty Rome must have been back then. People stopped living there because there was always hunger and disease. The Tiber flooded the city often, and the dampness made it easier for disease to spread. Ancient buildings were falling apart everywhere. What had remained under Theodoric was now given total value to the elements. Earthquakes would sometimes damage structures, but nothing was ever fixed. Columns that had fallen were left on the ground, and temples and other ancient buildings that had fallen were not selected. Some building materials were stolen and used to make new buildings. By this time, the outer parts of the city had been completely abandoned and left to fall apart. The old area around the Campus Martius and the Forum Boarium was now home to the last 3,000 people. In AD 608, the Column Pocus was built in the Forum Romanium to honor Pocus, an Eastern Roman usurper. They ruled at the time in Constantinople. The emperor was not very friendly, so this was an extraordinary honor, but people think that the column wasn't built from scratch. Instead, they believe that a fallen column from the imperial forum was just put back up and a statue of Pocus was put on top. That alone must have been an arduous task in this time of decline. But even at that time, the Forum Romanium must have looked pretty sad. It was kept up by Theoderich till the early 6th century. In fact, when the African monk Fulgentius, a Latin writer, saw the Roman Forum in the year 500, he said, "How beautiful must the heavenly Jerusalem be if the early Rome shines so brightly." But after the disasters of the Gothic Wars, which happened 100 years later, the Forum was no longer fixed up. The buildings were falling apart and plants were growing all over the grounds and facilities. In the middle of this decay, the Column of Pocus must have seemed like a joke. After that, the Forum Romanium was abandoned, possibly because of a big flood on the Tiber in the early 700s. As the Tiber went away, it left behind a lot of mud and debris, which would slowly start to raise the ground level. So the Forum Romanium would slowly but steadily begin to fall apart. By the 9th century, the ground was probably already covered with grass. By the late Middle Ages, it had become a cow pasture. Building materials were hard to come by in AD 530, so fallen temples that could still have been fixed were looted for materials to build new homes or churches. People started building smaller homes in the old imperial fora, which was falling apart. Temples that fell down were used to build churches. Rome had already begun to eat itself and turn into a city from the Middle Ages. Smaller homes were turned into more prominent buildings. This happened at the Theatre of Marsilius and in many other places in the big city. Since the Goths cut the water pipes during the siege of 538 AD, the baths had already stopped being used. The Colosseum couldn't be fixed anymore, but after every earthquake, building materials were taken from it. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus was shut down by Theoderich in 395 AD, looted by Vandals in 455, and the gilded roof was torn down, then sacked again by Narses in 571 AD. It was still standing on Capitoline Hill as an empty, barren, desolate husk that reminded people of a great time that now seemed like a dream or a legend. People who wandered through the vast structures must have thought that giants had built them. Once built to hold up to 250,000 people, the Circus Maximus was 10 times too big for the whole city. Only 5% of Rome's peak population could fit in the Colosseum at one time, but now it could do almost twice as many people. Most of the city would be empty except for the area around Campus Martius and Forum Boarium where people lived. There are populated areas and empty ones. Rome would now slowly start to turn into a massive field of buildings that are falling apart faster and faster, all of which are empty and abandoned except for a small area near the Tiber River that is still inhabited. As a result, we might argue that the Gothic Wars marked the beginning of Rome's demise, with the actual decline beginning in the 540s. The few buildings from the Roman Empire that still survive in Rome, such as the Pantheon and the Curia Julia, are those that were converted into churches. After 600 AD, Rome started the long process of changing from the empire's capital to a city in the Middle Ages. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel for more interesting videos. Thanks for watching.